be willing to take some risks and have conversations with partners that like you could never think would come together.
All right, welcome everyone. I am so excited to be here today with my friend, Dana Snyder. Dana, welcome to What the Fundraising.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm here. I feel like I should have already been here.
Well, you're doing one of my favorite episodes, which is a recap of a season. So we get to talk about sort of all of the best thoughts and topics that have come up throughout the season. And then we just get to sort of digest them together and get your insight, because you also have such an amazing podcast, Missions to Movements, that everyone should go and check out. And so this is going to be unique because I think it's going to give you an opportunity to talk about some different stuff than you usually get to talk about on a podcast.
I mean, this is basically just like an insight to what a conversation we would have. Talking
Yes.
about, oh my gosh, I listened to this episode. So basically, welcome everyone to Mallory and I talking.
Yes. Okay. So this is a day in the life of both of us, and the types of conversations that we have, because we are also always trying to process like new and exciting content and innovation together, and seeing what the other person thinks or what comes up for them, or if we're reading a situation with kind of the most curiosity that we can be. And I feel like we are really good at pushing each other to think about things differently. And we have different lenses, but we have a lot of the same core values and beliefs, which allow us to like create a lot of synergy around the work that we do.
Yeah, if you don't have Mallory's like my text buddy for ideas and back and forth. If there's like something that I'm pondering, or if I'm launching something, can you check out this page? So if you don't have somebody like that in your contacts, definitely start either with an individual or a group. Because I would say, I think that's honestly been one of the best things about us being colleagues, and we live on opposite sides of the country and work in different topics within the nonprofit space, but we still very much complement and provide really great feedback to each other. So everyone should have a Mallory.
And a Dana. I mean, it makes such a difference. It makes me think about just how much I wish I'd had that when I was an executive director or a managing director, because both roles, you know, being an entrepreneur is isolating, being a managing director, executive director, development director, those can all be really isolating roles. And so having someone who, you know, can be a reflection back to you and a support and cheer you on and celebrate successes. Like we're getting more comfortable bragging with each other, because it can be so uncomfortable for women to do that, and just like creating spaces to like be proud of each other and listen to each other, get to celebrate successes and celebrate with them. It's such a special relationship. I just love you so much.
It's the best. Love you back.
Okay. All right. So now we will actually talk about some content instead of just an all day love fest. So basically what I want to do is, I've been thinking a lot about some of the topics that came up throughout season 2 on the podcast, and I just want to chat with you about them. So I'll sort of share a little bit about what I heard on one of the episodes with one of our guests, and then we'll talk about it a little bit, and then I'll bring up something else.
Let's do it.
All right. So at the very beginning of season 2, I met with this woman, Vanessa Bonds, and she talked about the science of influence. And it was super interesting. We actually separated it into 2 parts. We talked about the influence of a fundraiser. So she wrote this book, You Have More Influence Than You Think. And so we broke it up into the influence of a fundraiser, and then we broke it up into the influence of a donor. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting about the research that she did is how much we underestimate our influence as fundraisers, because of this sort of believed power dynamic between the donor and between the fundraiser. And so one of the things that happens is the donor says something like, oh, it would be great to buy a new truck for the organization. And because of the science of influence, the fundraiser is like, oh my gosh, that donor definitely wants to buy a truck for the organization. Now we have to restrict the funding, and just sort of does the thing, taking that comment sort of as a strong recommendation or restriction from the funder, whereas the funder was just kind of throwing it out there. The funder believes, because the funder has a lot of agency in their own life, they expect the fundraiser would push back if it wasn't the right fit for the organization. But the fundraiser doesn't have that agency or doesn't feel like they have that agency. And so they actually don't get curious with the donor, and they don't talk about the real reason the donor might want that truck, for example. And so I'm curious, like when you think about the dynamics between, donors and fundraisers, where do you feel like there's kind of the most untapped potential for fundraisers to lean into their influence and recognize that they have more influence than they think?
I think this happens, such a good point. I think this happens with all of us whenever we're making any type of ask. Honestly, I think there's this. I was actually reading Julie Solomon, who you know as well, was my business coach last year, and she has this book, Get What You Want. And she talks a lot about the perception that we create internally that is not actually the truth or the reality. Like we are creating like this false reality in our minds of what we think a donor or what we think as the fundraiser can either receive or what they might think about us making that ask. When on the other side, it's like, no, I'd love to do that for you. No, let's actually explore that. Nope, let's go ahead and how else can I help you? What other things are you working on? You're like, wow, like this, we play in our minds, I think oftentimes, I don't know why we do this as humans, but this negative narrative of the way a conversation is going to go instead of oh, this is going to exceed my expectations of this ask. And I don't know. I just think the perception, we need to kind of shift our thinking and going into those conversations and be like, no, I'm presenting an opportunity. And then the opportunity on the other side is a gift to help. So my example, I like shared this on LinkedIn yesterday. Julie, who has like a top 25 podcast on US marketing that I've listened to for 5 years and been like my idol in the business world. When she asked me to be on my podcast, and I was like, what? And she's going to be on yours. And I was like floored. And to her, she's like, she's gone over now, but she still has a little bit of an awkward feeling asking as if it's an inconvenience, which to me, it was an honor. And how inconvenience and honor, like how opposite can those words be? And I think with influence, I mean, you have an influence for good in what you're doing. Like it can just lead to a more dynamic, hopefully, conversation.
I love that. And actually a lot of what you talk about with the discomfort with asking and how actually our sort of discomfort in anticipating needing to ask is even more uncomfortable a lot of the time. And Vanessa talks about this in the episode too, how actually people say yes much more than we predict them to say yes. And so it's like, and I think sometimes with fundraising, in addition to that, like focus on the negative, we also feel sort of so sometimes desperate for the money, or sometimes just like, I think desperate for the win. And we feel like they want to buy the truck, and I can take that back to my board and I can say I got this funding and I can sort of be done, versus opening up a more curious conversation around like, what do you believe the truck is actually going to do for our organization?
Right.
And how do we explore what else is possible there? Because that opens up the possibility of them saying, no, I do want to do the truck, which then would actually still leave you in the exact same situation as you were.
Yeah. Or it might be like, what is the real purpose of this need? Oh, let's talk about it. Actually, you need like 2 vans and you need gas cards for those. And you're going to need, let's say it's a kid organization, and you're going to need car seats for the vans. And it's like, and then it becomes this much larger conversation than if you're just going in with that one.
Yes. But we want to be like done,
Right.
We want to sort of like have that win instead of, and we don't trust, I think sometimes ourselves and sometimes the donors to be able to have that more curious conversation. And so I really want to encourage folks to go back, listen to those episodes. They are amazing. And there's so much in there about how to sort of lean into your own influence in ways that feel really good. I think the other thing in that episode that I love, and I'd be curious what how you sort of coach or think around this, is around, I hear from fundraisers all the time, like, I don't want to be manipulative. and that they feel like sometimes in fundraising, they're like manipulating the donor. And she talks about in the episode how like the biggest way to flex our influence is like in person, right? The
Yeah.
next would be like on Zoom, on a video meeting. The next would be phone. The next would be email, then text, or I think it's text and email, videos in there too. And she talks about how, so like, if you really want to help somebody make a conscious choice, you don't want to put them on the spot or sort of manipulate their decision making, then give them space to make a decision and let them
Yeah.
respond by email, because that lets them step away kind of from that influential moment. Is that something that comes up in your work a lot, or like people being like afraid to be too salesy or too sort of marketing?
Yeah, I think that
Focus.
like being too salesy comes up all the time. I would say not so much on the manipulation side, because a lot with digital marketing, right? You're giving the option
Mm,
to do something. And it's not with digital in my world, it's more I am providing you with this content and you are loving what I'm showing you, and you're going to a website and you're going through this funnel,
mm,
hopefully, of getting emails, and you're more immersed in the story, and then you decide to make the decision. So the decision is always on the donor to make that happen. But I would say in like a phone call situation or even being in person, I still think like you're presenting options and you're allowing them to, in the end, choose what they want to do and what they don't want to do. So, and if the answer is not right now or not at this time, okay, then
yeah.
like come back later on. Like that's okay. An answer to get, that's going to happen. That happens to all of us. No's are okay. And no's are great places for learnings. And they'd be like, what are you? And then the question should be, instead of no, phone call ends, like, what are you passionate about right now? Because it might be, I mean, even for me personally, with just things going on, my interests are changing in the ways that I want to
Mm,
give. And that just be a natural point of things happening. And let's just say somebody says it's not your organization, but you have a friend or you have a partner organization that's right up that person's alley. You say, you know what? I'd love to make an introduction to you. And that's still a win. I think we
mhm.
just need to like kind of rethink in our minds, A, you're not manipulating. You're not manipulating. Like that needs to be X out of the conversation. You're always giving people an option and a choice. I would hope, unless you're coming on the phone call and you're like, you must give.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting word to hear, right? I'm like manipulating them, but they feel like they're putting them on the spot. They're maybe like, I hear sometimes people say things like, I feel like when I do it with my friends or family, I'm changing a relationship from a personal relationship to a business relationship without their permission.
No, but like, look, the thing is, right? If you're scheduling a Zoom call with someone, it's scheduled. It's
Yes.
a premeditated thing. If you're going to an event, they probably bought a ticket to be at the seat. You know what you're expecting. I was actually just talking to my parents about this. They went to a gala. They're in Sarasota, Florida, and they were invited by their friends who bought a table. And my parents went knowing the expectation is we are going to sit down, we are going to learn about the organization, and we're going to give in
Yeah.
whatever amount, whether that's a silent auction item or we're going to become a monthly donor, like whatever we feel called to do. The expectation, we know that. And we are saying yes to go to this event because, yes, we are willing to do that. So I think no matter in what world that the exchange is happening, there's always a yes happening
Yes.
from the donor side. So,
Yes. Yes, totally. And there are these like gates of permission. That's what
right.
I say to folks. Like, if they're sitting down at that meeting with you, they've invited this conversation, unless you've really misled them about why you're talking to them.
Yeah.
And then you throw an ask at them, right? If you're like, oh, well, I just wanted to meet with you to get your, feedback on this, document that we created or this thing. And then you throw an ask their way. Okay. Then they're caught off guard. Then they didn't give you permission for that. And you can
Right.
learn more about that in that episode too. But yeah, I love everything that you're saying. Okay. All right. That was one of my favorite episodes. So I really could talk about that one all day. But
And wait,
there was
one last thing I will wrap just on like the social digital side. I think the word influence
mm,
has gotten a big confusion in definition.
mm,
And the fact that when the influencer space started, it was in order to have influence, I must be of a certain clout. And that's
mm,
not true. And I think that's part of like an old way of thinking. Whereas now in the marketing world, the nano and micro influencers, which can be us with less than 10,000 followers, technically, or less than 1,000, are the ones that actually make the impact because we have the real relationships with the people
Mm.
that are engaging with us. So it's so funny. I think I shared like a bathing suit that I had it ordered and I loved it. And I had 5 friends order it like the next day. So
Mm.
you have an influence and you do not have to be this huge, like Kim Kardashian, millions of followers type of individual. And so I think to be a thought leader too, in the same vein.
Yeah, I love that. It actually hits on a topic I talked about early in the season as well with Dominique James, who does PR really for impact driven businesses and nonprofits. And she talks a lot about the everyday expert and how you sort of
Yeah.
hone your own story to share your lived experience or the expertise you're working, on the ground in your nonprofit. And that makes that's a super important type of influence and narrative to be amplified, and that more and more folks are looking for and turning to, because those are actually the narratives that ultimately change the conversation.
Yeah, because they're real stories that
Yeah.
we can that it's relevant to us. Oh my gosh, I just had the best conversation. I recorded a podcast episode yesterday with the major gifts officer for the Preemptive Love. And
Mm.
she's 24. She's 24. And just her real, like, relentless grit, determination stories of the things that she has changed within that organization and pitched. And I was just in awe listening to it's what she's doing on the ground. Like
Mm.
those are the stories that created a LinkedIn post about that, pitch Forbes about that. Like talk about,
Mm.
I mean, I did a podcast episode on breaking down how I marketed my podcast for launch week and how you can replicate that to a campaign. It's these right everyday real campaigns and experiences that we just all kind of want to learn from each other on.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And I think really giving ourselves, there is in the nonprofit sector, I think sometimes, and historically, maybe this like paternalistic attitude, like when we think about grant funding and sort of the way that foundations have kind of overseen nonprofits work. Or another episode that came up earlier in the season when I was interviewing the executive director of Reading Partners in Washington DC was actually really similar to what you're talking about, or kind of what we're talking about right now, with how sometimes like in human work, what she was calling human work, everyone can feel like they're an expert or that they can sort of talk over maybe the nonprofit's expertise. And I think sometimes that makes
Mm.
nonprofit leaders shrink in their influence a little bit. And I think it's important to remember, like exactly what we're talking about. You have influence, you have really important expertise, really important stories to be sharing, and to be able to sit in that knowing and present yourself in that way. You don't need to have 400 million followers to
No.
have your voice matter or be important. And that is a really kind of limiting belief that I think a lot of nonprofits are holding.
I mean, I think it's a lot of all of us are holding. I think the imposter syndrome is real. It's super real. I'm doing keynotes now, like we both are, and I'm like, is this good enough? Am I actually sharing
Mm.
anything that's new? Is there going to be good
Mm.
takeaways here? And then you get the reactions and you're like, okay, like, yeah, okay, this was good. But you still like every time I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
is someone going to call it out that oh, she's not as far excelled in this area. Or, I mean, I'm
Mhm.
still yesterday, I'm trying to work on LinkedIn ads. And so I'm taking their certification, like always learning,
Mhm.
always growing. Friends of ours call my husband and I, like, because we love techie stuff. They're always like, you're our tech friends that are like 10 steps ahead and educating us on things that are going on so that when they're in production. So we have
Mm.
conversations, we go into these conversations feeling so educated because we've talked to you guys at dinner like the week before. And I was like, really? Like it would never think about that because it's just naturally what I know and what I do. And it's the same for you. And it's the same for the listener, whoever you are an expert in what you do because you're living and breathing it every day. But we just
Mm.
don't take the step back to actually write down, like, okay, this is a challenge for the listener. Grab like your notebook or a pen or paper and just start to write a list of all the topics that you could talk about for 10 to
Mm.
20 minutes that you could just riff on, that you have an interest in. And they don't have to be necessarily all professional things. They could be personal things too, like scuba diving. I'm just making that up. I know nothing about scuba diving. Maybe I want to go.
Me
Maybe that's
neither.
was in my subconscious. But just list all the things. And then you're like, oh, okay.
Mhm.
I do know some stuff. And then like
Mhm.
put asterisks next to the ones that you're like super passionate about, like the top 3 to 5. And those are the things that you can kind of rinse and rotate and repeat on speaking about.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. And I'm really glad you brought up the imposter syndrome piece, because I think there's this misconception that being confident and taking
Mm.
action around your influence or your expertise means that you don't have that imposter syndrome. And I think
Yeah.
for me, and I talk about this a lot, right? I actually think I have all the same narratives that everybody does, right? And like I
Yeah.
know you do too. It's about whether or not you let those narratives sort of define whether or not you take the action that you're trying to take. So I have
Yeah.
all those same thoughts. And sometimes what you need is a sounding board to say, hey, like, does this make sense? I'm so inside my head here. Is this going to resonate with the audience? Like when you're
Yeah.
speaking or something like that. But sometimes what it is just recognizing, for me at least, okay, of course that voice is there. This is a scary thing for me to be doing right now. I'm leaving my comfort zone. I'm venturing into new territory. It makes total sense that that narrative around me not having enough experience around X, Y, and Z is going to show up. But I think that narrative is so linked to perfectionism that that's
Mm.
why it's
Mhm.
never quieted, because
Yeah.
no one is going to have all the information on all the things, especially when we talk about what you and I do. Your field is changing rapidly
Yeah.
daily, right? Like there is no such thing as perfectionism. Mine is too. I mean, human
Yeah.
psychology, human behavior, we're learning more and more about that every single day. We can get more curious, we can refine, we can have more layered lived experience
Yeah.
on top, every single day. So if I search for the moment that I'm going to have all the information, I'm going to feel like an imposter forever.
Right. Right. Never going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, and part of it is fear of showing up to think you're going to get called out. In, I mean, in a totally different sector, my friend Brittany's a photographer and she's a amazing photographer.
Mm,
She did all my photo shoot for the podcast. And she's like, I don't know how you like put yourself out in front. And she's like, I don't know if I could
mm,
ever do that. I'm always like behind the
mm,
lens. And I said, you just have to, you just do it once. And it's going to feel uncomfortable. It's not that it doesn't feel uncomfortable.
mm.
It's like you just have to start to get into the groove and then it becomes a habit. And so she started to do Instagram reels and oh my gosh, if anyone wants to look her up, it's Brittany Morgan Photography on Instagram. She's hilarious. I was like, where have you been hiding this person who's like
Mm.
super funny? I know she's brilliantly creative because of what she does, but yeah, go Brittany Morgan Photography and you will just die laughing at her reels. And she's like, you like gave me the idea and the courage to just start. And that's sometimes what you
Mm.
got to do is just start, figure out your zone and maybe
Mm.
the platform that you want to start on. And she's rocking it.
I love that. And that coincides with, in episode 36, I interviewed this woman, Deetra Giles, and she's an executive coach. And she talks a lot about confidence. And she talks about how whenever we're learning something new for the first time, we should be ignorant on that subject.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like we think about that word as such a negative word, but it's not. Like we should be. And that's where we get to like be curious and we get to learn. And it shouldn't actually and isn't actually linked to our true self-confidence. And I think sometimes, I'm curious what you think about this. I feel like sometimes when we're doing something brand new, we have an expectation that we should be more uncomfortable. And so we're a little bit more okay with it, or we can get over the imposter syndrome a little bit easier, the perfectionism a little bit easier, because we're like, well, yeah, I shouldn't be confident about this because I've never spoken in front of 10,000 people live, for example. So we
Right.
sort of can like rationalize the imposter syndrome a little bit more. And then when we can't, are things that we like expect ourselves to be able to do more easily. So like I had a
Yeah.
client who was in a really uncomfortable scenario with their staff member, and she was really uncomfortable sending a particular email. And she could not stop beating herself up about her discomfort sending that email. She was like, I should have been more comfortable sending it. I should have been more like, confident in this. And like, so then her imposter syndrome around her leadership sort of came up, and she didn't know how to soothe it because of this like expectation she was holding for yourself. What do you like? How does that show up in your work? What do you think about that?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think that shows up in so many ways. I mean, with digital marketing, I think like you mentioned, it changes all the time. So
Mm,
you're constantly learning and staying curious and a little bit naive. And when I think I've wrapped my head around something that, oh my gosh, let's just think, for instance, around, I spend a lot of time in social ads, right? So if an ad isn't working properly, then I'm frustrated about like, what have I done wrong for
mm,
this is not working, right?
mm,
On the other hand, launching my podcast, never done that before. No clue really about
mm,
what to expect. Didn't really feel any certain way about it. It's just like, just gonna give it a
mm.
shot and see what happens. Um, so yeah, I think that's only natural for us to be able to have that kind of self questioning. And I don't know, I think it's just giving ourselves permission. I think the word of the last 2 years has been
Mhm,
grace.
mhm.
And I think it's just giving yourself grace on those areas that we're human, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, we're not going to have all the answers and figure things out. But I think even if a situation or something doesn't work perfectly, okay, what happened? I think something I used to say all the time when I worked at an ad agency was, we're not saving the world here. We're not
Mm,
curing cancer. We are
mm,
writing a tweet.
mm,
Like, let's just take a step back and let's think about in the big world of things, like,
mm,
how serious is this?
mm,
And then that kind of allows you to like, and with everybody has personal things going on and like, just I think sometimes you need to take a beat and just like breathe, maybe go take a walk and then come back to it and then realize
mhm,
this isn't as big of a deal. I am personally making this out to be such a big deal, but it's
mm,
not.
mm. Okay, there's so many things about what you just said that I think are so important. One of them is that I just do want to double click on the sort of like expectations that we have on ourselves and the way that that plays into us, like kind of upholding perfectionism and imposter syndrome and pieces like that. Because I think one of the things is like, I said to my client when that whole thing was happening, I was like, okay, if I asked you to go into a gym right now and lift 200 pounds, what would you say? And she was like, I could never lift 200 pounds. I was like, okay, so if you walked up and you lift and you tried to lift the bar and you couldn't lift it up, what would you say to yourself in that moment? And she was like, I don't know, probably not a whole lot. It would be like, no. And then I'd walk away. Okay. But if you believed that you should be able to lift 200 pounds, the narrative in your head would be totally different in that moment.
Yeah.
Right. And that's
Yeah.
what's happening. We're not recognizing that these are muscles we need to build, whether it's your digital marketing muscle, your fundraising muscle,
Yeah.
all these different things. And we try to lift some 200-pound weight. We can't lift it right away. We don't know exactly how to do it right away. And we start to like impose all these like expectations on ourselves.
Yeah. These false expectations,
Yes.
again, that
Yes.
we are just setting for ourselves.
Yes.
A
Yes.
lot of the times, no one is placing those on you.
Yeah. Yeah, totally, totally. And then I think that piece around, getting really clear about one, like where can you play and where can you test things and where can you try things out and just have a little bit more like lightness and levity and not take every single tweet or every
Yeah.
single social post or every single thing. But in my opinion, a lot of what causes that is our desire to prevent discomfort. And one of the things I've been really exploring recently, and I talk about this a little bit on the episode with Megan Siemens, is how much energy we spend trying to prevent discomfort in a way that makes us very uncomfortable in the present moment. I'm curious, like, what do you think when I say that?
That's just super ironic. And very true. I think, gosh, and this has been, I mean, you know, this has been a through line of my life recently, but there are so many factors where we're not in control.
Mm.
I mean, you can be as in the world of social media, like we're not in control if Instagram decides to shut down.
Mm-hmm.
We are not in control about how an ad is shown, like with the algorithm on the back end. We are not in control if our emails accidentally hit somebody's spam folder. We are not in control, like, right? There's so many things, and we get frustrated maybe just looking at the numbers and the data of things sometime to
Mm.
realize that there are so many different factors just in life in general that we are just a tiny portion of
Mm.
what can make a decision happen or what can make somebody see something. And if we only think about our role, and like I send out an email so everybody should see it. Why are my open rates so low? Why are the click rates so low? And
Mm.
not thinking about the tool that I'm using to do it and what's happening on the back end of their
Mm.
emails. And somebody could be on vacation. And like, if I'm only looking at my numbers and only thinking about what's happening in my world, then that's false. That's a delusion. And I guess that would then cause me discomfort because then I think I'm failing
Mm-hmm.
when there's
Yeah.
so many other circumstances at play
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah.
consider.
Totally. Totally. And yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying
Because I
because
think
what I'm,
normally we're so just the nature of like human, how we are and how we operate is it's what's going on in my world,
yeah.
right? What's happening right now for me. And it takes effort to think about all those other things. And
Mm-hmm.
it takes like, again, you have to like take a beat and be like, okay, there's a bunch of other things at play instead of
Mm-hmm.
just focusing on like tunnel vision of what's happening in Dana's world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we are just so geared towards like being self-critical in that way that we
Yeah.
start to just like get really hard on ourselves about whatever that sort of piece of the puzzle is. It's interesting. Another thing Deetra Giles said on her episode, I'm not going to quote this perfectly, but was something to the effect of like, people say that you are the culmination of your life experiences. She was
Mm.
like, but that's not true. You're the culmination of what you've made those life experiences mean. And I think
Ooh,
that's
that's
really
good.
right. I know. I think it might be the quote of the season. But it's something I think about a lot. I think about that quote a lot. And I think this goes to data too. It goes to those impression metrics. It goes to things that are I don't talk about this a lot in the podcast, but like me or like my like body image and weight, right? Like the other day I was thinking about how much I avoid the scale. And I was like, why do I avoid the scale? It's just a number. And I was like, no, it's not just a number. It's what do I say to myself once
Yeah,
I
when you see
see
it.
that number? If I could just see that number, it wouldn't. So like, how do I work on how I have my own back? No matter how do I get curious about that number? How do I
Yeah.
wonder things about that number? And I think that gives us a ton of power. And like, when we think about like the data you were talking about, even about impressions and all these things, it's like, the reason we get scared about looking at our donor data or looking at our ads data or looking at things like that is because we don't feel like we can trust ourselves to speak nicely to ourselves when we see that number or when we see that thing. But if we can work on that,
Yeah.
then all of that information just becomes empowering instead of something we need to avoid.
Yeah. And I think it's also when there's good things, right? You're like that
Mm.
peak, like that dopamine hit
Mm.
of like, oh, I was awesome. Like this was amazing. And we
Mm.
don't do enough. We don't spend enough time in that space, in the
Mm.
reward space to be able to say, I talk about this. I have a episode coming up about how I'm planning my quarterly goals for Q3.
Mm.
And I talk about like, there's a section, we both use the full focus planner.
Yes.
There's a section where it asks you to write a reward for yourself. And so often I will achieve a goal. And then it's like, okay, that was cool. Moving on.
Mm.
Like you don't even take a time like you worked so hard to achieve that thing that you purposely like wrote down and thought
Mm.
about. And then it just
Mm.
bypasses. And there's not a moment to actually like take it in and appreciate that moment. And what was the
Mm-hmm.
meaning of that moment and like making that goal happen? What was the purpose behind it in the first place? And like setting a reward or some sort of acknowledgement for yourself. And then on the flip side, if you're not seeing something that looks great, it could be something like looking at the scale, right? Is okay, well, instead of thinking about it in negative, is there a positive spin that you can tell yourself, right?
Mm.
About how that can improve or how you can learn on that thing that you're trying to adjust or tinker with. Yeah, it's just being more internally kind to ourselves, I think.
Yeah. And BJ Fogg, this is actually a season 1 episode, but he is a scientist around behavior change and habit building. And he talks a lot about this idea of shine, that if we want to cement good habits, we have to show ourselves shine, and we need to show it to ourselves around the action that we took, not just the result of the action. So like celebrating yourself
Yeah.
internally when you press post on the Facebook ad,
Yeah.
celebrate, and like working in those celebrations into the earlier things. And I talk about this with folks I work with around fundraising a lot. We say, oh, we care about our fundraisers. We want to improve the like mental health and burnout issues that are going on with our fundraisers. But from a tracking perspective, they're still only tracking money. And so if they want to build like healthier habits for their fundraisers inside, then they need to be celebrating, showing shine for fundraisers, taking scary actions, for being brave, for being courageous, for saying the hard thing, for having that donor meeting, no matter what happens, because that's actually what cements our habit.
Yeah, there's a lot of metrics that I think need to change in the nonprofit industry that dictate what quote unquote, I'm using my quote air bubbles, what success is and means,
Mm.
1,000,000%. That's a whole other podcast conversation.
Okay, actually, I want to talk about this for a second because I'm curious sort of how it might relate to this topic. I've never thought about this before, but I knew I had wanted to ask you about this interview that I did with this woman, Ayelet Fishbach. She's a motivational scientist, and she wrote this book called
A
Get It Done.
motivational scientist.
Yes, so the science of
What?
motivation.
Wow.
Yeah.
What an
Yeah. I
interesting,
probably
like,
should have said it that way.
niche.
Yeah. And so like really understanding the psychology of motivation. And so we talk on the episode around donor motivation, what motivates different types of donors to give, how much and when, and all these things. But we also talk about the motivation of the fundraiser. And we talk about this concept of the middle problem. She has this book, Get It Done. She talks about this concept of the middle problem, which we've heard about in the science of motivation before, around sort of how motivation wanes in the middle of anything, right? When we sort of start a project, we have initial motivation, then motivation really decreases in the middle. And then we see a lot of motivation at the end of something like a campaign, for example. And her recommendations for that in particular to fundraising for a campaign, right, are setting more incremental milestones, incremental celebration points that sort of exist in that middle period to help sort of keep you motivated throughout. But I have this other thing that I'm wondering about, because I feel like in fundraising in particular, when I think about sort of like the shiny object syndrome that we have in this industry, in this sector, I've been thinking a lot about like, is donor stewardship and really cultivation in a lot of ways a middle problem? Like, is it just this not exciting burst of energy for us, kind of like biologically, because it's not a new relationship or it's not right before a gift? And because we don't exactly know how to track what's happening in those moments, we just as a sector are not doing a great job continuing to sort of cultivate and build those relationships when we don't have very clear metrics associated with it. What do you think about that even?
I think that's fascinating. So I can speak, I haven't fundraised in the nonprofit space in a long time, since my first job out of college. But I did do fundraising in the business world I randomly launched a desk company I think we've basically briefly talked about this in our friendship, but launched a desk company at the beginning of COVID. Really brilliant idea. I did some crowdfunding for it. So I was fundraising and I was asking people for money to support this business to get it off the ground, which, to your point about the middle and the stewardship, I think I loved. And it actually, when I got feedback from someone and like had conversations after the fact about how excited they were about what I was doing and about how they were so excited to support in what I was doing.
Mm,
And then they would ask questions about the product and ask questions about my process that would like refuel, almost to be
mm,
like, oh, like they're really interested in
mm,
what I'm trying to do, and they're like going deeper with me on it. So therefore, like I'm more pumped to ask the next
mm,
person to keep fundraising. So I don't know. I think it could kind of end up being like this constant. If you, even with our podcast, I'm sure you feel the same way. Whenever I get a new testimonial or a review, I
mm,
get really excited because we're oftentimes just like speaking to a screen, to a microphone, hoping in return for some feedback. And whenever you get that feedback back from a donor in
mm,
sharing like maybe the impact of why it's so important that they're giving or why they're giving in the
mm,
first place, and you're able to make that outreach and then
mm,
get those responses back,
mm,
those to me fuel the continuous ask and the continuous fundraise. That's always
mm.
going to be in that middle.
Mm. Okay, I love that you said that, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like actually what you're doing in that situation is you're being so present in in the experience that you're having. They're actually able to feel that. You're feeling that sort of refuel when you see that review, or that, when you got that testimonial about the desk. And so it was activating sort of that shine, right, around the behaviors that you were taking. And it was
Yeah.
continuing to motivate you to the next piece. And I love that, because I think that's also a real tip for dealing with the middle problem. Like, I think another thing that I heard in, I'm now just thinking about it, in the episode with Megan Staples,
Ooh,
over,
and quick thought on that is
yeah,
if in your organization, if you use a Slack channel, or if you don't use Slack, if you just use email communication, whatever your comms is, and if somebody receives that note, everyone should see that note,
yes,
because that's going to lift up everyone in the organization, no
yes,
matter what their role is. Like send out, there should be in my, if you use Slack, which I love Slack for instant comms, there should be a channel that's nothing but like our impact, or
yeah.
like feedback from donors, and just have this like feed that goes off and gets pings whenever. One of my favorite things actually was when I was working with Movember, they have a gong. They had a
I
gong in
love
their
it.
office. And so when they reached like a certain and it was level of fundraising during the campaign, but just to hype everybody up, right? Because a month long of like really hardcore fundraising, like you're saying,
Mm,
the beginning of the month was like super exciting, like can't wait. And then it's like the middle of the month is like you're feeling a little bit of a lull. But every time that gong would go off, everyone would
mm,
cheer and everyone would clap, and there
mm,
would be like this celebratory moment. And the person who found it would like shout like, we just got this amazing gift from so
mm.
and so. And it was like this just contagious energy in the place.
I love that. And I think, and that's like a great example too of a pattern interrupter, right? So it's like, which is, I think like with Slack, I think I love the idea of Slack. As somebody with ADHD, Slack is harder for me, because when I see so many things happening
Yeah.
there all the time, it like just, I get a little bit numb to it, right? And then I miss messages because I'm like, well, it's just always going off, right? And so the gong is like, maybe for somebody like me would be, and obviously that's an in-person thing. Although I had a buzzer on my phone, like a ding on my phone sometimes, that I would ding when I was trying to build a habit around something, because it was like that jolt of like a pattern interrupter. And so I would also encourage folks like to celebrate I think what you're saying about making sure that everyone is getting those messages on a team is so important. And I think making sure that they're also said in a team meeting, because the
Yeah.
thing I was going to say about you that I think you're really good at in your business is creating enough spaciousness in your work to like really process what's happening in real time. And this is an area where I have struggled. I feel like a lot more, like booking back-to-back meetings. You're always like, Mallory, stop that. Or like
Yeah.
too many. And I know I need
Yo,
to
I
like,
saw her calendar the other week and I was like, whoa.
I
If she
know
doesn't
it's,
get back to you, I know why.
I know that's why I have that out of office forever. That's like, I'll be here in 72 hours.
I was like, do
But
you breathe?
I know it's out of control. I'm working on it. I'm really working on it. It's one of my growth edges. But one of the things I've realized recently is the biggest challenge that is created for me in not having spaciousness in my calendar is these pieces, is like actually feeling that celebration, is like sitting with like the win, you know, and taking those moments. And I think in fundraising, I know fundraisers' schedules look like mine. I know executive directors look like mine. And we're missing the opportunity then to feel those things and actually get them to like cement into us and change our brain and all of those things. And so I know spaciousness can feel scary, but like you could join me in the 50-minute meeting. You know, like I just changed all my Calendly links to like no more 60-minute meetings, 50-minute meetings. Like it's fine, you know, and just like having and creating some rituals, transitioning between meetings and stuff like that. I just think that's such an important thing. And that's also like, if you share positive feedback in a team meeting, say it, sit with it for a second, be quiet. Just like let everyone hear it, let everyone feel it. Don't just like run right to the next thing, because when we think about the integration of mindset work, behavior change work, all of these things, it can't happen without some spaciousness.
Yeah. And I think there's this, this was more so I feel like when I was living in New York City, but it was like this pride to say, I'm so busy. It was just like, if you're saying that, that means it was almost like saying like, I'm cool because I'm so busy. And that, I don't think that's as common anymore. But yeah, this year, I mean, I think for listeners, if you can set some really hard boundaries with your calendar I think it's great to allow for these times of recognition. I think it's also great for learning. Like I try and set time on my calendar just to learn and just to explore, like what I'm doing with taking this like LinkedIn certification is like booking out the time. Yeah, I set a really hard boundary for myself at the beginning of the year to not take meetings on Wednesdays and Fridays and Mondays, actually. Mondays are just podcast recording days. So Tuesdays and Thursdays might be really full, but the rest of the days are wide open. And it hasn't been, we're recording this in June, and it hasn't been a problem for nearly 6 months. Nobody's been mad at it. So just go ahead with your bad self and set some boundaries.
I love it. And have friends who hold you accountable for setting your boundaries and don't let your calendar look like mine used to look a few months ago. Okay. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you one other thing I'm just super curious for your like input on. So I did a podcast interview with Lynn Wester right when the war in Ukraine was starting. And the thing that we sort of ended up talking about on the episode that I had not planned for at all was what was happening around expressions of generosity in that moment. And so this was a moment where we were watching a lot of people give through Airbnb.org. We were watching a lot of people buy digital art on Etsy. And I've just been thinking about it so much since that conversation around all of the different ways that we can today express generosity and sort of build that identity part of ourselves that doesn't necessarily need to be tied to a nonprofit the same way that it used to be. I don't like using the word competition in general, because I think that is not a motivating word to use, particularly for folks in the nonprofit sector. And I do believe, we know that people, give, for example, to 5 to 7 nonprofits a year, that it's not like a this or that type of thing. But we did see in this Ukraine crisis, for example, people turning to other forms of generosity because it felt like the nonprofit sector wasn't sort of meeting their need around how they primarily wanted to express their generosity in that moment. And so I'm just thinking about, especially given what you do with like digital ads and marketing, now that it feels like maybe the nonprofit sector is being held up next to these other ways for people to express generosity, like how does that change the game, and what does that mean for what nonprofits need to be thinking about?
I honestly think it lends into creating really innovative partnerships is what should be happening. How can you partner with not only brands? How can you partner with people of influence? How can you think outside the box in when you are making that ask in your storytelling, which is really important. And it's not only the areas of generosity, but I think it's just overall what we are being shown as consumers and just
Mm,
how we're interacting with other businesses and in e-commerce. But I would say, yeah, I think it's be willing to take some risks and have conversations with partners that like you could never think would come together. Um,
mm,
there's so many great examples in the for-profit space of this. And I mean, there's really great examples in with the charity space too. I mean, Charity Water for World Water Day did a great integration with Pantone. And I interviewed their head of digital and he's like, yo, that came together like 2 weeks before the campaign went live. We just had a random idea to partner with them. They weren't even part of
mm,
like our original vision. And I was like, what? Like never would have
mm.
thought that, but it like came to them and they made the ask. You never know. During one of the episodes, it's on HBO, Insecure, Insecure with Issa Rae, I'm pretty sure. And in an episode, she gets into a lift and she talks about, I wish I had like a Capri Sun in here. And Capri Sun, and it like blew up on Twitter. And so lo and behold, Insecure and Capri Sun did like a whole partnership in Lyft where like
Huh.
with your Lyft rides, there would be little Capri Sun icons like moving all around the city. And if you clicked on one of those cars, like there would be Capri Suns in a cooler or whatever. So it's just like,
Mm.
that was so random, but like in these moments, how can you really think about thoughtful, meaningful partnerships that at the
Mm,
end of the day, I mean, what happened with Ukraine, we all felt tied to what was happening there, whether we knew somebody or not.
mm,
And we all, I think, love to be and have this calling to be generous and to help in
mm,
whatever way that happens. And so,
mm,
how can your organization really think about in with
mm,
your audience, what's their interest? What are they
mm,
consuming? Where are they going to watch things? What media outlets are they going to? Where are they
mm,
shopping? Right. And then think about those partners. And then is there like a really creative way that you can just explode generosity with
mm.
the two of you? And you're the
Okay.
queen bee at that space.
Well, I love that. And yeah, I would say if you want to learn more about like really unique creative partnerships, episode 41 with Kate Williams from 1% for the Planet is a great episode. Episode 54 with Julie Solomon, who we both know and got to interview that Dana was mentioning earlier. We talked specifically about brand partnerships and why nonprofit partnerships with brands or mixed into sort of what you're talking about, like a three-way partnership almost, makes that type of brand partnership so much more powerful. And I love that your answer to that was around partnerships, because I've been thinking about it a lot through the lens of like nonprofits and donor relations. But
Mm,
I think what you're pushing, which I really actually appreciate, is how can in moments like that we be creative to expand our sort of reach and access to us and
yeah.
our footprint on the issue area, which I think is super
We're
important.
stronger together. And I think it's always better to collaborate than trying
Yeah.
to go at it solo.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Okay. We could talk for the rest of the day on here. And apparently there were too many episodes in season 2 because I have like 45 more questions. But I'm going to cut myself off. Thank you so much for chatting with me today about all this stuff. I always just value your opinion and your perspective on all of these things. And so I'm so glad that everyone got to hear it today.
You're so welcome. Yeah, guys, let us know what you think. DM Mallory on all the places on Instagram. I don't know where you want them to DM you, but wherever. Let us know what you thought.
Yeah, we can't wait to hear from you. And thanks for spending this time with us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.